it is my distinct pleasure to introduce our next speaker. Our next speaker is Arthur Evans. He is the CEO of the American Psychological Association, and he is both a IIMHL and IIDL board member. And Dr. Evans is going to share with us his thoughts on valuing inclusion. So, Arthur, if you'll come forward. Thank you. And let's warmly welcome him up.
Good morning, everyone. Okay, I'm Baptist. You got to speak back to me. Good morning, everyone. Good morning. There we go now. Okay, now we're good. This is the time when you get to do a little work. So I'm going to set you up in a moment, but this session is on the issue of inclusion. Why don't we start with, what do we mean by inclusion? So this is my definition. It's full participation by everyone. Let me start with a few ideas about what that is. So first of all, how many of you have heard the saying, inclusion is about being invited to the party? Anyone ever heard that saying? No one's heard that saying? Just raise your hand if you've heard it. Okay, all right, so you've heard that term. So inclusion is about being invited to the party, but it's really not about being invited to the party, it's about being able to dance at the party, right? But inclusion is more than being invited or being invited to dance, it's being able to choose the music. That's when you have full inclusion. And so in my view, inclusion is about how do we create environments, organizations, systems, services that allow everyone to fully participate, and fully participate doesn't mean just actively or passively being there, but it means being an active participant in helping to shape that environment, those services, and so forth. Everyone with me so far? Remember what I said, I'm Baptist, you got to talk back. Okay, thank you, okay. All right, so let me give you a few principles that I think are important. First of all, inclusion is more than a value, it's an imperative if we believe in excellence. I assume that if you are in the business of providing services for people who have intellectual disabilities, people who have substance use conditions, people who have mental health conditions, that you are in it because you care, that you want to make sure that every person that comes through your doors, if you are operating a program or within your system, if you're operating a system, gets the best possible services possible. And the only way we can do that is if the services and programs that we design are inclusive of everyone, and in fact that they have to work for everyone. So that's not just a good thing to do if we believe in what we are in the business for, it is an imperative. The second idea is that if we're really inclusive, it's about equity. And what do I mean by equity? I mean not being equal. I've been married for about 35 years. And one of the things that I've noticed in those 35 years is that when me and my wife go to an event, a play, a concert, at the break, my wife has to spend a whole lot longer in that break than I do. I go into the bathroom, I come out, and there is always a line in the women's bathroom. Anyone experience that, right? Okay, drives me crazy, right? It must really drive you crazy if you're a woman. We have equal bathrooms. Bathrooms are the same size, but it's not an equitable experience. And a part of inclusion, in my view, is that we have to have equitability, not just equality. And that means that the outcomes, the experiences that we have to, that's where we ought to be looking, not at the front end in terms of what happens in the front end. Everybody still with me? Okay, got one more principle. Inclusion for mental health, substance use, and intellectual disabilities might look different. I had the good fortune before I became the CEO of the American Psychological Association to be a leader within a service system and service systems. One thing that I learned is that if we really want to make sure that every single person gets what they need, it's going to be different and it's going to look different. So for people who have serious mental illnesses, inclusion might mean if you have a very long-term serious mental illness, you've been institutionalized, inclusion might mean just being a part of the community in ways that is often difficult for people who have lived in institutions for a very long time. For substance use, it might be not having, so many of you have heard this idea of let's get rid of the checkbox around substance use or those kinds of things that prevent people from having gainful employment. For people who have intellectual disabilities, it might be making sure that venues within a community are people in those venues are trained so that people with intellectual disabilities can come to those venues and be accepted and be a part of those kinds of programs. So the idea of inclusion varies depending on who we are working with, what the issues are that we're dealing with, and we have to think differently based on that. So I'm going to give you three other ideas and concepts, and then you're going to start to look at some questions that get you to think about how do we ensure inclusion in all of the things that we do and provide. Let me give you the example of homelessness, and let me back up just a second and say, the first idea is this. As you're having your discussions, to think about the importance of choice and options for people. One thing that we know about helping people, we're all in the helping business, is that different things work for different people. If you look at any kind of program or services, there is no one size that fits all. So if we want to be maximally inclusive, then we have to create options and choice for people. Everybody still with me? Okay, so let me give you an example, and I'm going to pull from 3 examples of my prior life being a mental health commissioner and an intellectual disability commissioner. So take the issue of homelessness. If you look at people who are homeless, most of them, almost all of them have a behavioral health condition. They either have a substance use condition, mental health condition, most often both. But that is not a monolithic group of individuals. And so if we're going to be maximally effective, then we have to think about, first of all, multiple pathways for ending or getting out of homelessness. In addition to that, there are other things that we have to make sure. We want to make sure that it's research-based. We want to make sure that we're partnering between mental health systems and housing systems. We want to make sure that we leverage the dollars that we have available, and we want to use data to evaluate. But the main point that I want to emphasize is this idea of multiple pathways. So what does that mean? So if you take the people who are living on the street, who are chronically homeless, and this is work that we did in Philly, they're different. People have different issues. So one group of individuals have very serious mental illness, and many of you are familiar with the work of Sam Sembris from New York and his colleagues who created Housing First as a strategy for getting people off the street. So rather than doing what we've always done in the field, which is let's get people well and then get them into housing, they had a great idea, put people in housing first. Once we do that, we can be quite successful in then supporting people. So that's one pathway. But that doesn't work when you're talking about people who might have a cocaine addiction. If you take people who have a cocaine addiction, you put them in a house without helping them to stabilize, that's not really going to work very well. And so for those individuals, maybe we want to have something where people can get long-term residential services that then allow them to have the stability to be successful. And then there are some people who are not quite ready, and in that case, we want to have a harm reduction strategy. Right? So there's multiple pathways because there are different types of folks. And so essentially that's what we did, created these multiple pathways And interesting thing happened. This is just some data. This is actually cost data. First of all, we were able to get about 800 people who were chronically homeless off of the streets into housing. When we look back a year later, 89% of them were successfully in their housing. And this is some financial data that just simply shows these different groupings here are different pathways. And a couple of things that stand out, or should stand out. Number one is that the costs look different for different cohorts. So that first group is the safe havens. That's the harm reduction strategy. These are folks who are not quite ready to go, but we can get them services. The bars that you see there are 2 years out what services cost. You engage people, those services, the costs go up, but then they drop dramatically when people go into housing. So not only are people successfully going into housing, but they are also, the system is saving a lot of money. And if you look at these two cohorts, the outcome is the same, the costs are different. So really emphasize this idea that to be equitable means to make sure that people get what they want in order to get comparable outcomes. Second idea is data. If having multiple pathways is an important framework for us as helping individuals, data is a critical tool. So let me give you an example of why data is so important. This is data called penetration data. It's basically a proportion of people in the Medicaid program that are accessing behavioral health services. So in our case, this was over a number of years. It was 20%, and there was a nice little incline, which is a good thing. That means we're getting more and more people into services. But if you disaggregate the data, you get a very different picture. And the picture tells us that we can't pat ourselves on the back because we have an increasing line. We have to think about the different populations. And we would not have known that the penetration rates were this disparate if we didn't disaggregate the data. So if we want to be maximally inclusive, then we have to use data as a tool to help us with that. Everybody still with me? So if you look at this graph, not only is it important to disaggregate, but there's another point that I'd like to make. What stands out on this graph, it might be counter to what we might typically think about in terms of penetration or access to services. Anything stand out? What? Okay, stigma. Yep. Well, I think that's certainly a driver. But if you look at the data, is there any data here that is surprising? Yes. Okay, so Hispanics are the highest. So Hispanics are doing the best in this particular system. That is surprising. It's counterintuitive, and it's the reason that we have to measure. There's a researcher named Lonnie Snowden who says that disparities look different in every community. So you can't assume that the disparities that we see on a national basis are the same disparities that we'll see in our programs or in our communities or in the systems that we do. So using data is an important tool for inclusivity. My last point is this one. Voice is critical. When I was commissioner, we made no decision without people with lived experience being at the table. First question, whenever I was brought at results of, Commissioner, here are the results for the RFP, they knew what the first question I was going to ask. It was, who was involved in making the decision? And if people with lived experience weren't a part of it, we had to redo it. And just as a quick aside, if we're going to invite people with lived experience to be at the table, and everyone else at the table is being paid, you need to pay the people with lived experience. So that's just one of those things that is a value. If we value that voice, then we got to pay for it and treat it in the same way that we treat other people. I have this strong belief that inherent in every community is the wisdom to solve its own problems. And I think when we look at communities through that lens, and I will be the first to say as a psychologist, too often our fields have looked at communities through a lens of pathology or through a lens of deficit. But I don't care how poor a community is, how underserved it is, there is wisdom in those communities, and when we can tap into that wisdom, we can come up with really creative and dynamic solutions. One example is these are individuals from the Burmese and Bhutanese communities when I was commissioner in Philadelphia. And so this is a community that has many people who need mental health services, but they're not going to walk through the door of a traditional mental health clinic. I showed you the data around Asian penetration. So if we're going to be effective, how do we reach this community that's not going to use traditional services? You go and ask, and you listen. And people come up with great solutions. And in the case of this community, they came up with a really novel way of embedding mental health services within the places that people in their community already went. So rather than us, and so we wouldn't have come up with this solution, right? So our solution would have been, let's build a program over here and get people to come. Their solution was, take the places where people already are and put the services where people are. And that's how we were able to reach people in those communities. So the issue around voice, listening is critical for our ability to do that. So that's my story. I'm sticking to that. And hopefully it gives you a little bit of grist for your conversations. Last point I'll just make is, as you're thinking about your questions, think about sustainability, because there are a lot of things that we can do, and we do in our fields, where we might work for a little while, but the real trick is, how do we make sure that these things are sustained over time?